In the previous video, we created a couple of feature tests. In this video, we are going to create our first unit tests. But before writing those tests, let's first discuss why we need unit tests and what the difference is between feature tests. On first glance, there is nothing wrong with these tests. But let's change something in our code. Let's open up the blog post model and introduce a bug here in the scope where published function. If we take a look at the controller, then you can see that this scope is being used to filter out published posts for the homepage. And with this change, that scope doesn't work correctly anymore. Now let's run the tests. You can see that one of the tests fails. And if we scroll a little bit up, we get that beautiful output of pests. And this test, it works, but this test fails. It will only show published blog posts. This test indicates that a bug was introduced, but the failure message of this failing test doesn't give us an indication where that bug might be happening. There's so much code being tested here, the models, the controllers, the view. We don't know the exact reason why an unpublished post is showing up. So while feature tests give you a lot of confidence that everything is working correctly, when something isn't working correctly, it can be hard to pinpoint the exact bug. And this is where unit tests can help us. In a unit test, you are going to test a far smaller piece of logic, often a single class. And if that test fails, you get an indication where exactly a bug is occurring. I think that if you try to find a definition for what a unit test is, you'll find lots of opinions. Everybody thinks a little bit different of it. Some people say that it can't touch anything, not even the database. Some people say touching the database is okay. Some people say one class can only be used. Others say, yeah, you can use multiple classes. I'm a little bit of a pragmatic person, so I think touching the database in a unit test is fine. With that being said, let's create a directory where we will keep our unit tests. And here we are going to create another subdirectory where we are going to keep all unit tests for the models. And here we are going to test a blog post. In this video, I'm going to write tests for the first three functions that appear in the model. So let's bring up the model here. Let's uncomment this again. And let's create a test that tests this behavior. So here, when a blog post is being created, we are going to add a slug. So let's create a test. It adds a slug when a blog post is created. Let's add a function here where we will put the test itself. Here I can make use of the blog post factory. And let's create a blog post. Let's import this, put this in a variable, blog post. In Pest, you can make use of the expect function to write assertions. This is how you use it. You start with calling expect and you give it the variable that you want to write an assertion for. So blog post slug. And then you write what you expect of this value. I expect it not to be null. Isn't this a great API? It is almost English. Let's run this test. So I'm going to run it like this. And it fails. It fails unknown formatter sentence. And this might be a little bit off-putting when you encounter this error first, because your test seems good. Why isn't it running? Well, as we've seen in the previous video, in the pest configuration file, we say that all tests in the feature folder should use Laravel's test case. And we'll also use the creates application trait. Now these two will boot the application and will make sure that factories work correctly. Right now, we are only using test case and these traits in the feature tests. So in our test, Laravel isn't booted yet. We can fix this by also letting the tests in the unit directory make use of these class and traits. Let's try running the test again. And now it is green. Something that I often do to make sure that a test is working correctly is breaking the test. So let's put this in comment and then the test should fail. And sure enough, it fails. And it fails even earlier than expected because in our database we've defined that it is a non-nullable column. Okay, let's make it pass again. And sure enough, this works. We can still improve this test a little bit. And let me open it up in this part of the screen so we got the same layout as before. Let's make this test a little bit more specific by actually putting in a title, my blog post. And instead of asserting that it isn't null, we are going to make an assertion on the actual value. And we are going to say this should equal my blog post, like that. And the test is passing. Now let's try breaking the test, putting here something else, like that. And right now the test is failing, which is a good thing because it means that the test actually works. Okay, let's test the second function, is published. So this function returns true if the blog post is published and false if it isn't published. Okay, a new test. It can determine if a blog post is published. Let's give the function again. And I'm first going to create a couple of blog posts. First, the published blog post. Blog post factory published, our state, create. And here I expect the published blog post is published to be true. And let's copy all of this. And let's also test the inverse. So if we have a draft blog post, then we expect is published to be false. Like that. Let's run this test. And sure enough, this test passes. Let's try to break it by inversing it. And now it fails. Good, good. And now we come across the scope that we already discussed. Let's also write a test for that one. It has a scope to retrieve all published blog posts. Let's give it a function. Let's actually copy some of code that we previously wrote. So I need two blog posts, a draft one and a published one. And I'm going to get all published blog posts using that scope. So blog posts were published get. And now I'm going to make some assertions. So I'm going to expect published blog posts to have count 1, because there's only one post here that is published. The other one isn't published. And I'm also going to expect that the first one that I find, which is the only one that I'll find, that its ID is equal to the published blog post ID, like that. And of course, this variable name should be blog posts. Okay, let's try out this test. And sure enough, it passes. Let's try to break it by just doing something plainly wrong here. And sure enough, it breaks. We still found one post, but it was not the post that we expected. This expectation failed. Let's make it pass again. And there we have green. I want to say a few words on the structure of this test. In the first part of a test, in this arrange tab, we've created our world. We've created everything that we needed in our test. Then here we have an acts tab. We are going to use the functions that we'd like to test. And in the last part, we have an assert step, where we are going to verify that everything worked as expected. So arrange, act, assert. This is something that you'll see in many existing test suites. Okay, let's remove these comments again. And with this unit tests in place, let's run the entire test suite. And everything works as expected. And you can see that Pest grouped the output per test file. Now let's reintroduce that bug that we used at the start of the video. I'm going to put this in comments. And let's run all the tests again. And now we have two tests that are failing. The first one is our feature test. It will only show published blog post. That isn't working anymore. And like I've said before, we don't see an exact reason here. But in our unit tests, we also have a failing test, and this one tells us the exact reason why it is failing. It has a scope to retrieve all published blog posts, and this one is broken. If you have a feeling with your application, then the connection might be made very fast that the bug that causes this test to fail is probably the same bug that causes this feature test to fail. Now let's make sure that all tests are green again. And everything is working as expected. At this point, you might wonder, how many tests should I add? Should I test every little function in my application? And some people will say, yes, you need to make sure that everything is tested. For me, that's a little bit too dogmatic. Tests should give me confidence that if I refactor something or I change something, that the application is still working. I know, it's a little bit of a vague metric, but I hope it will become clear in the next videos.